Hi, welcome back. In this lesson, I'd like to go over some of my recommendations for your preferences settings in Photoshop Elements. The first option I want to talk to you about is found here in the Layers panel in the upper right hand corner. Click on this little down facing arrow here and choose Panel Options. Now these options are specific to your Layers panel, and this first setting has to do with the size of the thumbnail that you'll see over here. So if you had an element, a ribbon or a button or something over here, the thumbnail size now is set to its default of medium. If you like to see a little bigger thumbnail, you can choose to go the largest that they offer you, and obviously you can go smaller as well. The other thing that I think it's important for you to know is that you have an option of setting the thumbnail contents. Now remember, we're talking about the thumbnail of your layer over here, and right now the default is set to entire document. That means, let's say you have a ribbon, it will show you the ribbon in whatever size you've set here, but you'll see it in relationship to your entire page, whatever size your document is. So if your ribbon is over here in the corner, you will see a representation, a thumbnail icon of that ribbon over here in the corner. The other option is to have it set to show layer bounds, and that will show you the actual full size of the element. This can be really helpful when you're working with lots of layers and lots of similarly shaped items and you're having difficulty locating a particular element. Let me show you exactly what I mean. So I'll go over here to my custom shape tool, and the heart is here by default, so I'll just go ahead and draw a heart here, and then for our purposes I'm going to click the simplify button here. Now because I selected in the panel options, because I selected to show layer bounds, it's actually showing me the entire heart in the layer, and remember I can change the size of this here, but it's showing me the entire heart. If I were to change this to entire document instead of layer bounds and say OK, you see that it's showing me the heart as it's placed relative to the entire document. And as I said, I prefer it to work this way. My eyes are older and I need to see it bigger. So you have that option. The other preferences I wanted to show you are located in the Elements Preferences area of the menu. If you're working in Windows, you're going to need to go to the Edit menu and choose Preferences. If you're on a Mac, you come to the Photoshop Editor menu item and choose Preferences, and we're going to come into General. Just a few things I want to show you in this first General tab. Show Tooltips is set on by default. If those really annoy you, those little pop-ups that you get when you hover over a tool or a menu item, then you can turn them off. If your mouse has a scroll wheel, you can turn on Zoom with Scroll Wheel, which will let you do just that. Use your scroll wheel to zoom. I use a Wacom pen tablet, so I don't have a zoom wheel on my mouse. And the other thing I want to show you is this Allow Floating Documents in Expert Mode. And it's easiest to explain this by actually turning it on and then showing you. I'm going to go ahead and check this. And I just want to point out to you that we are in expert mode. Remember that from the beginning. We work in expert mode when we're working with all of our layers, and I'm just going to say OK. Now I'm going to press Control or Command M, that's N as in Nancy, to open a new document. I'm going to accept what this default is, and you see that Elements has opened up this new document in a floating window. Some people like to work with their windows floating and some people hate it, but either way, if you have that box selected and you decide that you want to dock your document, you can do that easily. Just drag it up here to the top, and when you see the blue highlight, you can let go. And now you can switch between your open documents up here on the tabs. That's all that does. So let's go back to our preferences. In the Saving Files dialog box, you can leave these defaults as they are. Just be sure that Maximize PSD file compatibility is set to Always. In some versions this was set to Ask, and what that means is every time you save a PSD file, it's going to ask you if you want to maximize your PSD file compatibility, which is silly. So just go ahead and set that to Always. Recent file list contains 10 files. You see that you can change that number if you wish. What that means is when you come up here to the File menu and you choose File, Open Recently Edited File, that's grayed out right now because obviously we're working in the preferences. But if I'd opened lots of files, I could conceivably go back and open one that I had up to the last 10 files would show there. The higher this number, the more memory this particular component is taking up of your system memory, and so your system could start to act a little bit sluggish. If you do notice that, this is one of the things you may want to set back to the default of 10. In the performance pane, this section is telling you that Elements has already determined how much RAM is available for it to use on your computer, and it's setting what it thinks is the ideal amount of RAM to use. It's set at 70% right now. If for some reason your system is acting really sluggish, maybe you have too many windows open, because Elements is using up 70%, that doesn't leave a lot for lots of other applications to work. So you probably want to leave this set to what the default is. Know that you can change the number, use the slider to change this number if you need to do that. And if you notice that your system is acting really sluggish after you've bumped this all the way up, you want to come back and take another look at this, maybe move that number back down to somewhere in this range that's suggested by Elements. Down here, a scratch drive is complicated, and it's important enough that Adobe actually gave you its own description of what this is. Now if I move my mouse down here, it's going to go away, so I'm going to leave it up here so that you can see that. Basically, a scratch disk is an extra drive that you may have attached to your computer that Elements can use to write files and to call up and to save files. Basically, it's using your system's RAM and the scratch disk to manage how fast information is coming to and from Elements as you're opening and closing documents. I know that sounded confusing. The reality of it is, unless you have a very, very fast external drive, in a Mac, that's a FireWire or a Thunderbolt drive, something that accesses very quickly. In general, USB connected drives are not terribly fast. You're probably not going to mess with this. I'm sorry, I don't know what the equivalent is on a Windows machine. But if you do know what that means and you do have a fast drive, you could actually set one of these drives, and you can see I have several, but they're all USB drives, so they're not quick. That means that the communication between the computer and the drive, because it's going through a USB cable, is not very speedy. They're not really worth my effort. But if they were, I could choose one of these, and then Elements would use that drive to help my system performance. Remember earlier I mentioned that the history panel shows you last X number of steps you performed while you're working on a document while it's open, a PSD while it's open. Well, this is where that number is controlled. 50 history states is a lot, but if you're doing a lot of work, it's potentially not enough. You can go ahead and change this number, but once again, the caveat is that the higher this number, the more this particular component is using of your system RAM, and if you start to notice system performance issues, you're probably going to want to come back and change this number back to 50. In displays and cursors, this controls the size of the brush tips that you see in any of the painting tools. This is a normal brush size tip, that's what it's set to by default, and you can see on this little preview here that that tip is pretty small. I prefer to work with a full size brush tip, and you can see it just gave me a little more information about where I'm actually stroking. Another way you can be a little more precise is to check this button here that says precise, and then instead of the round circle you actually see these little crosshairs. It gives you a little bit more information about where you're brushing. In the transparency section, I don't really change anything here. You know, when you have a PNG, a PNG file open, you know that it has a transparent background. That's when you see those checkerboard look. This is controlling that checkerboard, whether that grid is, what size that grid is and what color you're using. Feel free to muck with that if you like to, but I've never changed it. Under units and rulers, If you're in the US, you have no need to change this unless you prefer to work in another method. You can change from inches to pixels, centimeters, millimeters, points, picas, and percents. That's up to you, but as I said, if you're working in the US, I recommend you leave this set to inches. The most important thing to look here, and if you haven't changed your settings, this will already be set for you. Your print resolution should be set to 300. That's the minimum resolution you need to get a good quality print. And then your screen resolution is set to 72, which is basically the maximum any computer monitor can show. In guides and grids, again, there's not much to change here. If when you have your guides or your grids visible and you're having trouble seeing them, you can change the colors here. You could also change how often the grid lines appear. 1 inch is the default, and that pretty much works for most circumstances. If you're doing very, very detailed work, you may want to come back in and muck with these numbers to see if they help you out. We're not going to be touching on plugins, but the last thing we are going to just talk about is the type area. Use smart quotes is set by default. I really haven't had any problem with smart quotes. You can turn that off and see if it makes a difference for you. But the most important thing for you to know about is that you can actually control the size of the font preview when you're in your text tool. You can choose to go all the way up to huge and all the way down to small. I actually like mine set to large. This is another one of those things though that affects your computer's memory usage. The more fonts you have and the larger you make the preview, the more system memory this particular component is going to take. So you should have this as small as you can put it and still comfortably tell what kind of font it is you're attempting to use. Now, if you've mucked around with these and you've got things messed up and you can't figure what the original settings were, you can come back to the General tab and then click on Reset Preferences on Next Launch. When you do that, you'll get a little pop-up dialog box that warns you that the reset settings will not take effect until you've closed Elements and opened it up again. So we'll just say OK. There's one more thing I meant to mention to you. One of the things that drives me crazy about Elements is that every time I use a keyboard shortcut for one of my tools, and I'm a big keyboard shortcut fan, every time I press, say, the T for the text tool, type tool, I end up accidentally switching text modes when I don't mean to. I'll forget I'm already in my text tool, press the T key, and if you look down here in the options bar, every time I press T, it switches modes. So I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally hit my text tool again and ended up with vertical text or this text pen tool, path tool, or in the brushes tool. I think I'm in my regular brush tool and I'm actually in one of these other modes that I don't want to be in. Drives me bonkers. So there actually is a way to fix that if it's bugging you too. Come back into your preferences in the general panel and just check this little box here that says use shift key for tool switch. And once you activate that, when you press the B key, and I'm going to press it again, you can see that nothing is happening here. I'm still in my main brush tool. Come to my text tool, and you can see as I press the T key, nothing changes. However, if I do want to change text modes, now because I checked that box in preferences, I just hold down my shift key and press T, and as you can see, I can now switch between the modes. So if that's something that's driving you nuts, there's an easy way to fix it. Thanks very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.